представляти сестру Гелен Альфорд просто приємно. Як будь-кому з нас було би приємно говорити про особу, яка є близьким приятелем. А сестра Гелен є таким близьким приятелем нашого Українського католицького університету. Водночас представляти сестру Гелен Альфорд є по-своєму і складно. Уявіть собі CV, curriculum vitae на 12 сторінок, single space, малий шрифт. Отже, знаєте, нормальне CV для нормального християнського лідера, яким є сестра Гелен. Але відповідно про все я сказати не зможу, тому мені доведеться вибрати якісь тільки найголовніші моменти. Все ж таки почну здалека. Сестра Гелен Альфорд за своєю першою освітою і першою професією, яку вона реалізовувала, є інженером. І не просто дипломованим інженером. Вона здобула PhD з інженерії. І свою освіту інженерну вона здобувала у Британії. Вона народилася у Британії, закінчила університет Кембриджу. Але вже у своїй тодішній дисертації з інженерії вона заторкала питання, які є важливі з точки зору розуміння людини, з точки зору гуманітарних наук. Її докторська теза зосереджувалася, зокрема, на питанні людиноцентричної технології, а також того потенціалу, який існує для гуманізації праці у машинобудуванні. Пізніше, у 1994 році, сестра Гелен, тоді ще не сестра, Гелен Альфорд, вона приєдналася до домініканського згромадження, отже, стала монахиною. І цього року це якраз є 20 років, своєрідний маленький ювілей, власне, монашого служіння сестри Гелен, з чим ми її вітаємо. Вона тоді здобула богословську освіту, переїхала до Риму і почала працювати на відповідальних академічних і професорських посадах. Зокрема, з 2001 року до 2013 року вона 4 рази була обрана як декан факультету соціальних наук Понтифікального Папського університету святого Томи Аквінського у Римі. А з листопада 2014 року її обрали віце-деканом того самого факультету. Щоб розуміти її академічний профіль, її наукові зацікавлення, достатньо подивитися на окремі курси, які вона викладала протягом своєї академічної кар'єри. Історія і розвиток технологій, працевлаштованість і безробіття, людський розвиток і технології, історія християнської соціальної думки, управління і організація в неприбуткових організаціях, економічна етика. Крім того, сестра Гелен займалася адміністративною роботою не тільки на рівні факультету, але вона була лідером, скажімо, дуже важливого процесу в будь-якому університеті, а тим більше в університеті католицькому. Вона разом з ректором була відповідальна за створення стратегічного плану розвитку університету святого Томи Аквінського. Має в цьому великий досвід. Була творцем відповідного департаменту, який відповідає тепер за стратегічний розвиток цього університету. Крім того, вона була протягом 3 років директором по якості у своєму університеті. Тобто розробляла різні процеси, які мали би забезпечувати і гарантувати якість академічну і наукову. Сестра Гелен Альфорд була і є керівником кількох цікавих наукових міжнародних проєктів. Один з останніх проєктів, який має ось-ось завершитися, це є дослідницький проєкт «Католицький університет між секуляризацією та ідентичністю», який дивиться на феномен католицького університету в сучасній добі, як на нього впливають процеси секуляризації суспільства, і як цей університет може зробити свій унікальний внесок у сучасне суспільство. Зокрема, частиною цього проєкту є вивчення досвіду католицьких університетів Центральної і Східної Європи, які є добре їй знайомі. Не можу також не згадати ще один важливий проект, який цього року стосувався українців, української діаспори у Римі, а саме проект, який називається «Студіо Реальта», і він спрямований, яким керує сестра, і він спрямований на потенційних студентів різних іммігрантських спільнот у Римі. Ідея є зрозуміти їхні міжкультурні проблеми і допомогти їм їх розв'язувати. І, власне, перший рік реалізації цього проєкту, його учасниками були українці, молоді люди, майбутні лідери нашої української діаспори Італії. Цікаво, що коли програма для цього проєкту реалізовувалася, головний аспект, який визначили організатори, чого бракує українцям, це підприємливості. Отже, і тому цей проект був, власне, скерований на те, щоб розвивати елементи, навики підприємливості в українській громаді у Римі, Італії. Сестра є автором багатьох книжок або глав до різних книжок, і я не буду все перелічувати, і, очевидно, статей. Я би хотів лише згадати дві речі. По-перше, одна з книжок, можливо, найважливіших, сестри Гелен Альфорд, вона була перекладена у Києві, і це є книжка «Managing as if faith mattered. Christian social principles in the modern organization». Менеджмент, коли віра має значення. Оце поняття, що віра має значення не тільки в приватному житті людини, а в політиці, в економіці, в технологіях, в освіті, у всіх сферах суспільного життя, це є те, що характеризує, я думаю, дуже влучно всю діяльність сестри Гелен. Ну, і не можу не згадати також текст, якого сестра Гелен разом зі своїми колегами була натхненником, а також співавтором. Текст, який нещодавно був перекладений на українську мову і був презентований 3 місяці тому у нашому університеті. Англійська назва це є «Vocation of the Business Leader», покликання лідера бізнесу. Текст, що про нього, він є унікальний, що про нього багато не говорити, просто пригадаю слова одного американського журналіста. Він сказав, що Сократ міг би пишатися цим текстом. Ну, я не знаю, чи може бути ще більша похвала. Ну, хіба що Сократ відпочиває. Ну, але це, знаєте, може в публічному просторі так не прийнято говорити. В кожному разі, завершити свій виступ, своє представлення нашої почесної гості я би хотів однією цитатою з апостольського повчання святішого отця Франциска «Радість Євангелія», яка теж вже перекладена на українську мову завдяки катехетичній комісії нашої церкви. Цитую. «Вийдім і подаймо всім життя Ісуса Христа. Повторюю тут для всієї церкви те, що не раз казав священикам і мирянам Буенос-Айреса. Волію радше церкву, яка зазнала ушкоджень, поранену і брудну через те, що вийшла на вулиці, аніж церкву, яка хвора через те, що закрилася в собі і ухопилася за власну безпеку. Не хочу церкви, яка перейнята тим, аби бути центром, а врешті-решт закінчує тим, що опиняється в плетеві нав'язливих ідей і процедур. Якщо щось і має викликати в нас святий неспокій і докори сумління, то нехай цим чимось буде той факт, що багато наших братів живе без сили, світла і розради від дружби з Ісусом Христом, без спільноти вірних, яка б їх прийняла, без сенсу і мети в житті. Маю надію, що нами керуватиме не так страх помилитися, як страх замкнутися в структури, які дають нам ілюзорне відчуття захисту, в норми, які перетворюють нас на невблаганних суддів, у звички, з якими почуваємося спокійними, тим часом, як на дворі, голодний натовп, а Ісус без упину повторює нам: «Дайте ви їм їсти». Коли я намагався собі уявити тих людей, які для мене могли би бути уособленням такої церкви, про яку говорить і мріє папа, то сестра Гелен Альфорд була у їхньому числі. Dear sister, thank you for coming. Thank you for having accepted our invitation to deliver your commencement speech, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vice Rector Dok. Your Excellency, Bishop Bogdan, Your Magnificence, Father Rector, Your Magnificence, Father Rector of the University, the Honourable Representative of the Ambassador, the Reverend Fathers, Venerable Brothers and Sisters, dear faculty and students of the Ukrainian Catholic University and the Holy Spirit Seminary, and above all, dear graduates. It is a great honor and a privilege for me to be here with you today. I'd like to open with two personal stories which can help frame our main topic today, I hope. Firstly, I'd like to take you back over 20 years. We are in a small room in a building occupied by the Management Studies Group, a number of researchers and research students who form part of the Faculty of Engineering of the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Now, there are 3 other people in this room apart from me, and we all have a copy of my PhD thesis in our hands. The only difference between my copy and theirs is that theirs are sprouting a forest of comments on little post-it notes. The little colored sticky pieces of paper made by the big American company 3M, which everyone was using at that time because they were still very new and novel. We are in early 1993, and this is the oral defense of the PhD thesis I had written, about which Vice Rector Dobko mentioned something. The title was Cellular Manufacturing, Business Integration and the Humanization of Work. Now, thanks to a suggestion of my father, which led me down a long road of discovery, I ended up including a chapter in this thesis under the rather unimaginative title, Basic Concepts and Approach, in which I used some key ideas from Catholic social thought to help me look at the problem of making work more human in modern manufacturing systems. Ideas like the idea of the human person in Catholic social thought, of human work, and of the common good, among others. In our department at this time, anyone doing anything even remotely close to what I had done would rather use a completely different body of thought called the Frankfurt School of Critical Sociology, and Habermas in particular, but never anything like Catholic social thought. This was unheard of in the department. So, as I sat before this commission, these 3 people with my theses, with all the post-it notes stuck on them, the thesis, as I sat before this commission, I began to feel that I had made a bit of a too daring choice to introduce this Catholic social thought into the thesis. I was wishing I hadn't done it at at that point. But I shouldn't have worried, because when we got to this chapter, this was number 2, chapter 2, the Commission turned the whole chapter over, going straight to chapter 3. They ignored chapter 2. And to justify this, they said, your position in chapter 2 is very interesting. You may know in English, this is the way to tell somebody it's not interesting, is to say that something is interesting. Okay? Your position in chapter 2 is very interesting, but it's held by a statistically small number of people. Now, I could see that this little statement had been prepared before I entered the room, and it was their polite English way of saying, we don't have to know anything about what you've written on this topic, we don't need to ask you any questions about it, and we don't need to take it seriously. Now, if I had had more courage at that moment, I would have asked them, what is your frame of reference for saying that the number of people who hold this position is small? Obviously, there were not many people in the British academic establishment who held such a position. But if the frame of reference was expanded, say if we thought about the whole of humanity, then perhaps we might have a different view. Not so few people hold this position. Anyway, I'm very glad to say that I got through that exam and received the degree, like you're receiving your degrees today, since I'm not sure that I would have had the pleasure of being with you today if I hadn't done so. Okay, so that's the first personal experience. Now let's fast forward to this year, 2014. I'm in the office where I work in the Angelicum, and there's a knock at the door. It is the Secretary General of an important research institute in Rome, which is called Eurispes. It was actually founded by one of our students. And with him, there are 2 men from the Netherlands, so 2 Dutchmen with him. One is director of a body called the International Association for Social Equality, the IASQ. And the other has just moved to Rome, where he is in the process of setting up a body with the rather grand title, the European Observatory on Social Equality. This observatory will be part of a network of such observatories all around the world, run by the International Association for Social Equality. Now, you might not have heard of this idea, social equality, because it's quite new. It's a new and innovative idea that is taking off around the world to deal with the multi-dimensional nature of human well-being, all the different aspects of what it means to have a good human life. That's what they're thinking about with this idea of social equality. Now, during the conversation that we had together a few months ago, I gave them a copy of a book which 2 of us in our department had edited a few years before under the title Preaching Justice, Dominican Contributions to Social Ethics in the 20th Century. And that was the end of it. I just gave them the copy. We said goodbye. Now, sometime later, the director, one of the Dutch fellows who was in this conversation, the director came back to me again, telling me, this book is very important, he said. Would be very important to their work on social equality, since it deals, as he put it, with normative factors. That was the way he put it, normative factors. And that while he and his colleagues know that normative factors are important to social equality, they haven't any idea how to deal with them. They don't know what to say about normative factors. In a follow-up letter to that meeting, the director of the International Association of Social Equality wrote to me, and I quote, "Your book points out an important gap in our work. The debate on normative factors has been underdeveloped until now. It would be good to discuss more in depth how we can both learn from each other. So, that's the second little story. So let's think about these two events, okay? In 1993, in relation to defining what work means for human beings, the British academics cast any contribution that the church could give as marginal and unimportant, of no interest to them. By 2014, in relation this time to defining what social quality might mean, Dutch academics, the leading figures in this new field, see that what the church can offer could fill important gaps, as they put it, and want to pursue a dialogue so that we can both learn from each other. Now, you might say we can't compare these two events. In the first case, we were talking about work in an engineering department, and in the second case, we're talking about social quality in a social sciences department. But I would say that decent, fulfilling work is a crucial part of social quality, and that in fact, the two situations are much closer than they might look. And furthermore, that the difference in the reaction between the mainstream academics to what the church could offer is very important and worthy of note and worthy considering. 1993, no interest. 2014, we need what you have to say to us. Quite a different reaction. Okay? So, my question I'd like to explore with you today is what's happened over the last 20 years? Why did we have these two different reactions, opposite reactions, in fact, completely opposite? Well, to put the argument in a nutshell, and then I'll explain a little bit more about it, I would like to say that we increasingly recognize that we face problems that we cannot solve with our current models and dominant academic paradigms. We don't have the thinking and the theory we need to resolve real human problems today. The leading thinkers, especially those in the more innovative fields, are looking around for different voices that can give them new and useful ideas. And it turns out that the church, in her social thought, for instance, does have something refreshing, new and different to offer experts in economics, politics, sociology, and yes, even in technology. Now, to begin to justify what I just said, this reason why I think we have this change in the reaction between 20 years ago and today on the part of the secular academics, to justify this, let me give you only two examples of the kinds of problems that we face currently that we can't respond to with our current thinking. And I'm sure you could come up with even better examples. So first of all, the financial crisis. We are still struggling to deal with this terrible economic problem that has put so many people out of work and destroyed so many people's lives. We realize that the flawed way in which theoretical ideas about mitigating risk, the so-called black skulls theorem, were applied in the mathematical models of major financial institutions in a flawed way. But even more than this, the general sense of malaise, the feeling of badness that the crisis has brought about, has brought problems to the fore that were recognized before but which nobody faced up to. For instance, there was an important paper published by a professor from London Business School in 2005 with the title's very interesting, Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management Practices. It is a withering critique, a very serious critique of the major management theories and how their limited and even false assumptions have ended up encouraging the very behavior in business, opportunistic, greedy, untrustworthy, that they were meant to stop or to keep under control. Or, as one writer in our electronic journal, Oikonomia, put it in an article called Beyond Business Ethics, he said, trying to mix or put together business ethics with management theory is like trying to mix oil and water. It's a hopeless task. But you might say, well, business and money making, okay, they've always had a hard time in dealing with ethics. The fact that our theories have difficulty with it now is no big news. You know, it's always been a problem there. So let's turn to our second example I would like to give you. This is the problems faced today by one of the great values of the Enlightenment, the idea of tolerance. When it's faced with one of the major social problems we have today, this is social exclusion. One of the key problems that the Pope today is writing about, the exclusion of whole groups of people from society. As David Hollenbach, a Jesuit ethicist in Boston College, has shown, encouraging people to be tolerant of each other may have a lot of social benefits. It's a good thing to be tolerant of each other. But when it comes to confronting endemic poverty and social exclusion, this value is just not strong enough, or an attitude or a virtue. As Hollenbach suggests, without complementary ideas, such as the common good, societies that cultivate the Enlightenment idea or value of tolerance, such as the United States, he's writing about the United States at that time, do not seem to have the cultural capacity, the cultural resources, or the capability to confront exclusion in an effective and long-lasting way. Exclusion is one of the big problems in the United States, even though it's a very tolerant society. So these are just two examples. Other very powerful ones of the problems we face today that we can't resolve with our current thinking could come from the ecological crisis, from global inequality and development issues, when we talk about migration, healthcare, and so on and so on. The list goes on and on. Now, some thinkers are saying that we are at what they call an inflection point, one which could be compared to the inflection, a major change in thinking that took place at the beginning of the Enlightenment. Now, at the grave risk of making an unfair generalization, but I'm going to take this risk, we may say that the leading thinkers of that time turned against traditional thinking, symbolized for many of them by the Church, with its focus on social order and hierarchy, to put individual freedom at the center of their concerns. We may remember perhaps the most emblematic phrase of that period, the opening line of Rousseau's book, The Social Contract. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. They did this in part because new questions were arising which they couldn't answer with the traditional thinking. Questions that arose from the powerful combination between science and technology, for instance, which was a new phenomenon at that time. Science and technology had been separated from each other up until then. We have the beginnings of capitalism, the rise of national identity as well, and a deep yearning for human fulfillment through the use of man's rational capacities. All these things are happening at this, around the 1750s, the beginning of the Enlightenment period. Now, although the Church experienced many hardships and difficulties as a result of the Enlightenment, culminating, we could say, in those of the French Revolution, we need to see beyond these difficulties to the important advancements that were made. If we look today at parts of the world that have not been through a process of enlightenment, where we might say traditional cultures are still the norm, are still the predominant influence on the way people think and behave, we can see many of the problems that such cultures face. Too much relation on family, too much emphasis on family relation, nepotism, putting people in positions because they're related to me. Too little respect for the rule of law, too much respect for the will of an individual. Okay. Too much corruption. All these kinds of things. All cultures have corruption. The most enlightened culture in the world has corruption. But no, they don't have so much as you find in some other parts of the world. So I would say, I think we can say, in the providence and mercy of God, through the Enlightenment, through this very difficult experience for the Church, the humanity as a whole has been able to make important steps forward, which are now increasingly part of the patrimony of the world as a whole, as well as being valued by the Church. Things like the importance of fair procedure in social relations, treating people as equals independently of the circumstances of their birth, their gender, their religious belief, and so on. The value of democratic process, for instance. Now, I would say all these things did indeed exist before the Enlightenment. They existed in nuce, in the seed, especially in the Church's tradition. But one would have to say that it was only in the historical period of the Enlightenment that they were really able to assert themselves over the entrenched earlier ideas that were endemic in classical Greece, for instance, that some people are better than others, that some people are naturally slaves, for instance, or that political participation is only for adult male property owners, something that even the Enlightenment itself took a long time to get out of its system. Now, it's for reasons like these that I think St. John Paul II, the great Pope who blessed the territory here when he came to Ukraine, as we heard, St. John Paul could recognize that the arrival of the idea of human rights was providential, and that it was a modern form of the ancient idea of natural law. But, this is where we come back to our time, just as the Enlightenment thinkers turned away from the dominant thinking of their time because it was unable to answer the burning questions of their day, so today we need to move beyond the answers that they gave, the answers that knowledge developed within their paradigm, the Enlightenment paradigm, can give us. Because we have to do this, as the examples from Hollenbach and others that we've mentioned indicate. We don't want to lose the gains that were made during that period, but we need to incorporate them into a bigger vision. As all the examples of problems we face today that I've given so far and that we could think of suggest, our key problems now are not so much to do with human freedom as they were then, but they're to do with how do you combine human freedom with social good? How do we deal with social problems like inequality and exclusion, or with systemic problems like environmental change or the global order? What we need to do now is to find a way of thinking that can overcome the fundamental dichotomy in Enlightenment thought between individual freedom and the good of the whole, the good of the community, social good, where greater social good for them can only be gained at the expense of individual freedom, and where goods can only be shared by making trade-offs between individuals or between groups. This is the limit of their thinking, which we have to go beyond. And I would say we have that capacity to do that in our tradition, in the church's tradition. We need to remember and to reintroduce into our theories, our social theories, our economic theories, our political theories, all the ways we think in the university. We need to reintroduce into our theories the other dimension of the human being that got lost in the thinking of the Enlightenment. We need to see human relationality as an intrinsic part of who we are, which the church teaches us by telling us that we are made in the image and likeness of God, in which relationality is a central part of who God is. So we need to see human relationality as an intrinsic part of who we are, where we can realize common, shared objectives together, creating common goods, and thus weaving together the rich fabric of social life. We do not forget that each human person has an individual dimension, but we add to this, we incorporate it within a spiritual, self-transcending, intrinsically relational dimension. In doing so, we may build on the gains made in the Enlightenment, not losing what was good and valuable in it, but also recognizing its limitations and its need for revision and development in the light of today's problems. Now, some of the key resources we can offer for this from the Church's tradition are things like the personalism, the philosophy of personalism from Jacques Maritain, or the thinking on natural law and freedom from philosophers like Servais Pinckaers and Herbert McCabe, and many others that we could think of. And then we need to connect the resources of these philosophical and religious thinkers to modern technical disciplines like economics, like politics, like social sciences and international relations. In this, we will be helped by the many new discoveries being made in neuropsychology, in genetics, and in behavioral economics, all of which are tending to show that being in relation is part of who we are, not just useful to us in gaining individual objectives. We will also be helped by many new things that are occurring in the real economy, apart from the theory, the good management practices we were talking about before. New things like the idea of co-opetition. Co-opetition tries to put together cooperation and competition, thinking about how these two things work together in the economy. Or the idea of wikinomics, people have called it, where we're using the internet and the social networking as a basis for economic outputs. So this thinking is beginning to come in, this connecting relationality with individual groups, starting. We also have great capabilities in this new idea of big data, of being able to look at massive trends on the global level or national level without sacrificing the individual diversity. So we keep both of these things, the individual and the group at the same time. So all these things are happening in the university that are pushing us, making it possible for us to make this combination. And so this finally, and we're nearly at the end now, this finally brings me back to those opening two stories we talked about, and the move from a lack of interest amongst educated elites in what the church has to offer to an attitude of actively seeking out what the church has to say. The difference is so great between those two stories. From the time of the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, and on into post-modernity, the church has been, as we say in English, on the back foot. She has been on the defensive and marginal to mainstream academic discourse. I would suggest that in the near future, in the lifetimes of these young graduates finishing their courses today, we will see a big change in this. We will see the church and Christian thinkers working in the wider academy, becoming leaders, becoming people who will lead this change, this development that we all need, that society as a whole needs, the world needs, philosophically, culturally, and spiritually. and what we have to offer will be recognized as important. I ask myself if this is another way of thinking about the new evangelization, this great idea that John Paul II launched some years ago. And so, I cannot finish without thinking about Ukraine and about the role of Ukraine and UKU and the Ukrainian graduates leaving the university today. In this big point of inflection, in this big change that is taking place now, it may be that the Catholic Church in Ukraine and young professional Catholics like yourselves and UKU as an institution of higher education could have an especially important role, a particularly important role. Because you are used to living in the borderland. I'm not thinking so much the borderland between East and West, even though that's also true and important, but rather in the borderland between crisis and hope. In the borderland between seeing the massive problems we have to deal with and confronting them in a hopeful way, trusting in God as we do that. It is those who can live in the tension between crisis and hope, and can deal with that tension creatively to innovate and to bring forth new ideas and new life for the people, who will be the cultural leaders in the future. I think Ukraine will become a cultural leader in the future because of what's happening, because the world will need what Ukraine and what people like you have to offer. So may it be that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people can play their rightful role in this wonderful future ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Дуже дякуємо нашому сьогодні професору, промовцю і прелегентові за таку велику надію, яку ми почули. Церква завжди промовляє, але церкву не чують. І ми віримо, що ваша праця і ваша надія, те слово надія, яке ви нам дали сьогодні, воно здійсниться в тому світі ще в той час, коли дійсно церкву треба почути. Дякую, сестри.